for those of you that are not aware who I am, I'm Lisa Stansby. I'm the Dean of the School of Art, Architecture and Design here at Leeds Beckett University. So I'm just going to do a fairly quick 10-minute introduction with a few what I'd call musings about today's topic. So first of all, welcome to sunny Leeds and Yorkshire. We've got people from a lot of different art schools and institutions around the country. So thanks for travelling to attend the conference today. Just to start with an anecdote and probably actually continue with a few more. As Dean here, we have different responsibilities. We have open days for students that I'm sure you're all aware of, and for those of you in institutions, you do the same thing at your institution. And I do a Dean's Welcome at the open days, so welcoming prospective students. And I start it with an anecdote that I wear two hats, and that isn't really just about the size of my hair. It's about the two hats that I'm talking to prospective students with. And it's a hat, the first one as a graduate of this institution, and particularly a graduate in fine art, so I studied fine art here in this very school. And secondly, it's the hat of the manager and the dean of the school which I studied within. So with that in mind, I was going to reflect a little bit on my own experience here as a student, and in particular a fine art student. So back when I was a student here, I wanted to come here because of the reputation of Leeds Poly, and actually not Leeds School of Art, which I have to admit I hadn't even heard of at the time. So I travelled all the way from Birmingham up to Leeds and had what I think I'd probably describe as quite a full-on interview at the time with a couple of members of staff. And I actually found out that I'd got a place on the course in an actual letter that came through the post, which might seem odd to us nowadays. And in that September of that year, I packed up bedspreads and candles and things that I was interested in into a friend of my mum's car, and they drove me up to Leeds to settle into life in Leeds as a student. So I was a fine arts student here, not in the 60s and 70s of the Leeds Poly that you see in the corridor outside. It was quite a bit later. When I was a student, John Major was the Prime Minister. It was 2 years after the invention of the World Wide Web. I also graduated a month after Tony Blair and New Labour came to power. So it was quite a different time. The year I started the course, Damien Hirst was busy offending vegetarians, and I was one of those. I was a vegetarian. And the YBAs were still Y. As a first-year student, though, on the Fine Art degree course, I was aware from the word go that those 3 years were heading towards what seemed to be one single point, the degree show. And it seemed to loom quite large and seemed fairly serious, and it might be something that might trip you up in the final year of a 3-year degree. I actually, and this is completely true, still have dreams about my degree show not being ready on time. And it's the same recurring dream that it's not quite finished in time for being assessed. In those days, you didn't really get a breakdown of the marks you got for your degree show. I can't remember if I was actually aware of any of the assessment processes or criteria that I was assessed on. I'm pretty sure I wasn't aware of it, or if I wasn't taking much notice. And interestingly, I'm sure you're all aware of this, results were also an exhibition. So in order to get your results, you had to go into a room where they were pinned on the wall. So your results themselves were an exhibition the day after the opening of your degree show. There wasn't huge amounts of people that turned up to read those results, surprisingly. So I wasn't entirely clear as a student what my marks were as such, or how they'd been assessed. And actually it wasn't until years later I was applying to do an internship at the Brooklyn Museum of Art in the US, and they asked for a GPA. I didn't know what a GPA was either, but it meant I needed a breakdown of my marks. So I requested this from this institution, and I finally got a breakdown of the different elements of my final degree classification, And I was quite surprised that the dissertation that I so loved writing was actually not, it seemed, in the marks I received, the main reason that I'd done reasonably well. It was actually the practice. So it was all a bit of a surprise about 3 years later. So most of us here in this room work in institutions, and we possibly work in institutions that are drastically different to the ones we studied in ourselves. But not surprisingly, we bring the ideals and approaches of that education with us. And I can speak for myself here, it's not always necessarily the best thing. We might expect students to arrive with the confidence to be risky and challenging, perhaps like we were, or at least that we thought we were. But our current students live in very different times. They live in precarious times, educated from primary and secondary level with a focus on results and testing. And I know this from experience, as I have a small person at home that actually I was told was tested from 6 months at her nursery on her abilities in various different things, and traffic lighted in how well she could do those things. Our current students have experienced unprecedented levels of connectivity to online spaces, predominantly via their phones. And this potentially affects their lives and their views on the world. Connectivity can be overwhelming and can come with also digital social exclusion. Critical thinking skills are needed more than ever in order to question the kinds of things we receive online, and also for individuals to develop their own sense of kind of judgment. So some students might struggle with some of these things. And obviously, alongside all of this, there's the commercialisation of higher education, meaning a very different experience for our current students who have got to work long hours alongside studying in order to get through their studies. 2 weeks ago, a fellow head of an art school from a city that I know very well gave a presentation at the CHEED conference. He talked about the feeling that we need to engage institutionally, not in robot polemics of the creative and cultural industries, but of the idea of corporate versus social needs. He understandably, and in his position, he said he was compromised, he understandably had no answers how he might do this. And I think that's one of the things for me, in a way, to think about today, that I don't have particular answers about the notion of fine art degree shows, and in particular fine art education. But I do think it's important to discuss the way that we do things in education, so we can think of different, perhaps alternate approaches that might be proposed that bear a relevance to the kind of students that we've got in this time and in this space that we find ourselves. And talking about where we find ourselves, we're in Leeds. So we're in a fairly unique setting. I'm not sure if it's entirely unique for fine art education. We've got 3 BA fine art courses within walking distance of each other. Each one is sending out fine art graduates each year. Each one of those institutions has a fine art degree show, and it's historically been on different dates, as if perhaps somehow we need to keep that going because the audience might be diluted. But there might be some propositions to bring those 3 shows together, I would hope, in the future, to have an experience perhaps more evenly across the city of some kind of dissemination of student work. There has been over the years, and I haven't got the time to go into them, some challenges to this idea, particularly within Leeds. And there's more written about that you could probably find online and in various papers about student projects that have challenged it. So in terms of today, our proposition, when we wrote it about the conference, was to think about a few key questions. So is the degree show a platform that meets the diverse needs and ambitions of the whole of the student cohort? Are there practices that have been successfully incorporated in the range of experience that we now have within a student body? What are the prerequisites for, could be a debated word, success or the fulfilment of expectations, and how do these impact on the student condition, and how do they impact on a student's approach to independent learning? So these are some of the things that hopefully our presentations will be looking at today. We've got a range of presentations from people from different institutions, so really exciting programme to be presented that I'm really looking forward to hearing. So I hope you all enjoyed the day today, and you'll be hearing some brief remarks from me at the end of the day. I hope if you are staying over, if you're not from Leeds and Yorkshire, that you enjoy the city of Leeds. And also just a word to the presenters that I won't be pinning your grades up on the wall afterwards for you to go and read. So thank you, everybody. And I'm now going to hand over to our professor, Simon Morris, who's the school's Director of Research, to interview our first keynote speaker.
Lisa, can I just add that 1997, the year you graduated, was also, apart from the ascendancy of Blairite New Labour, was also the year that the Deering report was published into higher education, and that set up the whole professionalisation process, including what was now the Higher Education Academy, and tightened up the whole business of assessment with aims and objectives and so on. So that seems to be a significant aspect of that particular year as well.
All right, thanks for that.
Cheers.
Simon.
Right, just a very brief introduction. I can see the whole room, and there's nobody in it. So said Roy Lichtenstein in one of his paintings, redolent with his dry wit. Or another example might be Michael Asher's intervention in the Claire Copley Gallery, Los Angeles in 1974, when he had the privacy wall separating the exhibition space and the office space removed, thereby architecturally and visually connecting the otherwise segregated commercial and aesthetic activities taking place in the gallery. In doing so, he turned the gallerist into a performance artist and put the secret machinations of the art world on public display. Or my personal favourite, in Argentina, Graciela Carnevali welcomed opening visitors to a totally empty room. The door was hermetically sealed without their knowing it. The piece involved closing access and exits and the unknown reactions of the visitors. After more than an hour, the prisoners broke the glass window and escaped. Finally, Yoko Ono's 1963 tape piece 2, Room Piece from Grapefruit, her book of instructions, which instructs its audience to participate, take the sound of the room breathing. It goes on to stipulate an evenly spaced frequency of daily recordings, as if the participant were a nurse on rounds, tasked with monitoring the interior architecture's vital signs. Number 1 at dawn, number 2 in the morning, number 3 in the afternoon, number 4 in the evening, number 5 before dawn. If someone was tasked with monitoring the vital signs of the British Art School, then that person would certainly be Paul Winstanley. In his Riding House publication, and it's this book here, and I have to say, those of you who know me, I'm a complete bibliomaniac. This book is amazing, and you should get one. It's only 26 quid for a hardcover. You need this on your shelves. It's a beautiful thing. Okay. In his Riding House publication, Paul Winstanley documents 55 art schools in Britain, scrubbed down, quiet, and still, after another round of degree shows, and loaded with expectant potential for the new intake to come. This is a brilliant piece of work, and one of the most beautiful books I have ever encountered. It is breathtakingly brilliant. Just turning the pages, one can almost sniff the white vinyl matte emulsion and recall the smooth, dry touch of the sanded white boards that divide the spaces and mask off extraneous architectural details. It took me, just like Lisa going on a memory trip, it took me right back to my own art school experience when in 1990 I spent 2 days sawing my way out or through 54 planks of wood in order to extricate myself from a 6-foot wooden cube. I did make it out of the box, out of the white cube and into the world, but I'm delighted to be reminded of that special space up and down the country where endless creative projects take place annually. We are truly delighted and honoured to welcome our first keynote speaker, Paul Winstanley, to give the first lecture of the day. Please join me in extending a very warm Yorkshire welcome to Paul Winstanley. Just
okay.
button down your arm.
Well, hello everybody. Thank you very much for that enthusiastic introduction. I didn't know my book was that good, but I'll take it from you that it's pretty good. That's excellent, thank you. In response to the previous speaker, I'm not from an institution. I'm an independent artist. My association with art schools has been, at best, has been intermittent. I've never held a secure tenure as a teacher in an art school, although I've taught in art schools over the years. My main connection with art schools was as a student in the initial period. And so my relationship to it and my relationship to the project I'm really going to talk about today is one of slight distance. It's one of something of an outsider, something of, it's a project that looks at the institution of the art school in a way, from a slight distance, a little bit objectively maybe, and not from the inside, not as if I was a participant myself. I want to talk a little bit about my history in relation to art schools, going back to the beginning and just beginning to sort of talk a little bit about where this project came from. It didn't come out of a clear blue sky. It was a project that engaged me for 5 years. This is a painting from this project. I am a painter, not a photographer, although I use photography. And it's a very typical painting from the project. I'll talk more about that later. The project took 5 years. It engaged me from about 2011 to 2016. It was a period in which I produced over 50 paintings. I produced the book of photographs. I produced an archive of several hundred photographs, sets of prints, watercolours, an array of work. It was an explosive period of work, and it came out of concerns I had for art school and art school education, as well as the need to develop my work itself internally in terms of its own language. It was a combination of two things. While I'm talking about the history, I'm just going to flick through some images of paintings, not to do with art school, but these are paintings produced over a period of 20 years or so through the 90s and the noughties. They show the kind of institutional spaces that I was interested in and have been interested in developing images of, paintings of. They come from photographs. They're generally oil paintings on linen. I'm not going to talk about this work. I'm going to show these paintings, show these images while I talk a little bit about my relationship to art schools. My decision to go to art school was a really last-minute decision. It was August 1972. I was 18 years old. I had got a place at university to do geography. And with weeks to go before this course started, I decided, no, that wasn't what I wanted to do. I think I want to go to art school. I think I wanted to go to art school all along and had been doing what my grammar school education had persuaded me was the right thing. And I decided, no, that wasn't what I was going to do. I was from Manchester, I was living in Manchester. Manchester Art School was full, the foundation course was full, which was actually quite fortunate because it meant I got a grant to go somewhere else. And where I got a place at the last minute was Coventry. Then it was called Lanchester Polytechnic. The art school's now it's still there, it's the same building, it's now part of what's called Coventry University, but it was a polytechnic then. It was really fortunate because Coventry was a boom town in many ways then. The car industry made it rich, made it wealthy at least. Everyone had jobs. And after the Second World War, this wasn't that long after the Second World War, it had been rebuilt with that kind of optimistic flair for everything modern that came in the post-war period. Lanchester Polytechnic was hard by, right in the centre of Coventry, hard by the cathedral, the fantastic Basil Spence building, which was itself full of great works by Sutherland and Piper and others. This was kind of important in some ways as well, in terms of later my development as an artist. That sense of an optimistic, forward-thinking, modernist idea of the future was kind of born in that environment, in that period, in the very early 1970s. The other thing that characterized the foundation course, and I only really understood this later when I compared my experience to other people on other foundation courses, was it was quite different in some ways. To begin with, it was what you would expect from a foundation course. It introduced you to the different sort of strands of work that were possible in an art school, different painting, sculpture, ceramic, textiles, weaving, printmaking. But about halfway through the course, things started to change, and we started to get these really dense texts on A4 pieces of paper that were the beginning of projects that we had to make work from in response to this text. What had happened, what was going on in the art school, was that Terry Atkinson, Art and Language, was in charge of the fine art course upstairs. And he'd arrived about 3 or 4 years later, 3 or 4 years earlier, and had instigated a kind of revolution in which challenged all those previous preconceptions about how art schools should work and how they should operate, and the sort of empire of people teaching painting, or the empire of people teaching sculpture, or those little kind of power structures that kind of kept everything going. He kind of leveled that and tried to introduce an idea that the art object itself wasn't important. What was important was the kind of DNA of art that underpinned it, which was this textual approach to art. Now, this was, 1969 or so when he arrived, and it was, of course, incredibly revolutionary. It was the equivalent in political terms of a kind of Trotsky cell arriving in some political party and kind of chipping away at it from underneath. It was revolutionary, and there was blood on the studio floor. As a baby kind of student on foundation course, we were fairly sort of immune to it, except that the culture did filter down 3 or 4 floors to the floor where we were operating as foundation students. One consequence was these textual projects that we were getting. And the interesting thing for me, and it stayed with me my entire life, is that when the work was the work we all did could have been anything. It could have been made out of anything, which was the point of it in many ways. But it was judged not in terms of its aesthetic. It wasn't judged in terms of whether it was good art or not. It was judged in terms of whether it satisfied the brief. In other words, the important thing about the work was its conceptual underpinning. That was the basic line, the baseline of how that work should and was judged. And in a sense, that stayed with me all my life, all my creative life, in that the conceptual underpinning of everything I've done since, I would hope, is in a sense at least as important, if not more important, than the aesthetic considerations that emanate from the work that arises out of that. So that was a fantastic experience, okay. You can see certain images here that might have derived from Coventry. They don't, but they might have done. Art schools were very connected to one another. Staff at Coventry came from Stourbridge. Staff from Coventry went to Cardiff. Stourbridge teachers taught at Cardiff. People at Winchester visited other art schools, and students from any one of these colleges doing foundation course went to other colleges to do their degrees. When you were in an art school, whatever art school it was, you also felt this sort of interconnection with other art schools beyond yours. I went to Cardiff and did my degree, partly because I already knew staff there who'd been into Coventry, and staff who visited Cardiff, whose work I was interested in, who taught elsewhere. I was interested in the work of a painter called John Mitchell, who was head of painting at Stourbridge, and when I went to Cardiff, he visited and taught me during my course at Cardiff. The course at Cardiff was typical of any degree course at that time, and it was a structure that I regarded and thought of as, this is the way it is, this is how art is taught, this is how fine art is taught. You arrive after an initial period of given a few putative kind of projects to do, you're given a studio space, You're invited to think about what you might do yourself. Encouraged to start doing something. No one tells you what it is you want to do. You decide that for yourself. And then someone comes along and shoots your ego down after a little while and applies some heavy-duty criticism, and you pick yourself up and you improve things, and it goes on like that. This is what I thought art education was, and probably always had been. But it took a while to realise that art education hadn't always been like that, and far from it. And actually not that long earlier, from 1973, when I arrived at Cardiff, was it, in fact, it could have been very, very different. It was only since 1960 when William Coldstream produced his report, when he was the chairman of the National Advisory Council for Art Education. A very conservative man, dapper little man, who I got to know, and well, I got to meet anyway later when I was a student at the Slade, who produced this incredibly radical, liberal report, which liberated art education in the United Kingdom, and turned it from a sort of parochial attempt to teach the subjects of art, like life drawing or lettering or heraldry, for God's sake, was on the course in different places. Perspective drawing, introductions to design, introductions to architecture. The range was could be arbitrary. It could be it could be a whole set of things that might not even connect with one another. From that into something that was self-centered, self-governed by the student themselves. This was an incredibly radical thing to do. And even more unbelievably, it was accepted by the government at the time. It was put into practice, and it worked. But it worked on the basis that there were resources. My course at Cardiff had, in my year, there were about 30 students. The whole fine art course consisted of about 90 students. There were at least 30 members of staff permanently there who were fine art, who taught in fine art, or who were technicians in fine art. And on top of that, there were a constant stream of artists invited to come and give tutorials, give lectures, seminars, the whole range. It was sometimes difficult to find the time to do your own work. You were fighting off people who wanted to. If you were in the studio all the time, you were likely to be the subject of some, attempt to give you a tutorial by some kind of visitor who was at a loose end and couldn't find any other student. So it was incredibly well resourced, and it worked because of that. The head of the school was a man called Tom Hudson. His title was Director of Studies, and he was one of those people, along with sort of Harry Thubron and Victor Passmore, who in the early 60s had helped to develop, actually in the early 50s, had helped to develop notions of a more connected kind of art school education when they had instigated the design course at Newcastle from 1954 onwards. And he was given this brief. He arrived at Cardiff in 1964 and was given an incredible budget, told he could do whatever he wanted. It was a brand new building. He invited the staff he wanted, and it was like a golden time. The nice thing, and I think this is true, the nice thing from my point of view is that I think I appreciated it. I actually felt, and this isn't retrospective, this isn't nostalgia, this is, at the time I thought I'd kind of died and gone to heaven. I thought I am being given these resources, I'm talking to all these artists, and they were artists I respected, and they were coming to talk to little old me in my studio space, and I had a studio space that I could do large paintings in if I wanted. Even at the end of the first year, I was being rather ambitious, but I did jemmy my way into a third-year student and into a third-year studio, and did a 10-foot by 20-foot painting, which kept me busy for the whole of the final term of my first year. If you were ambitious and there were things you wanted to do, you could do them. There was there was no one with clipboards telling you what you could and couldn't do. There was Cardiff offered things like performance. Performance was a big part of it. Performance, film, photography, these were part of the course in the 1970s. And people got involved in all these things. I stayed fairly much with painting, but did help out and work with other people who were doing performance work. So I got this kind of overview of what was possible there as well. Finally, I went to the Slade, spent 2 years at the Slade, met Bill Coldstream, a very different kind of art school, an art school embedded in deep history, and you felt that mantle as you walked through the door, or I did, as opposed to these shallower art schools I'd been to before in terms of history. My final year at the Slade, I remember thinking, this is probably the last time I'll ever be able to work full-time in the studio. This is it, this is, from now on, I'm going to have a job, I'm going to have to teach, I'm going to have to do this and do that. I won't be able to work in the studio full-time. This is it. Enjoy it, Paul, while you can, make the most of it. And by God, I did. I really, really did. And it was, and for quite a few years, that was the case. You left art school and you needed to find a job and you needed to work and do this kind of thing. My relationship to art schools post-art school, post-student life, were intermittent, as I said at the beginning. In the 1980s, I did some teaching at Falmouth. It was 1 day a week, and they organised that so you would go down for 4 days every 4 weeks. It was just as well resourced as anything I'd experienced in the 70s. Purpose-built, beautiful purpose-built modern studios lit from above. A good ratio of staff to students and resources laid on. And then in the 1990s, I taught at Goldsmiths in London. So that was also well resourced because it had a lot of money, because it was part of the University of London, and attracted a lot of artists who went there to teach because of the reputation of Goldsmiths and because of its connection to the YBAs who had all been there just a few years earlier. And all those students coming through had that great ambition to become artists, and were, there was a certain kind of dynamic quality going on there between staff and students. It was a good place to be. But I was at the same time also being invited to talk and teach at other art schools around the country, just to give a lecture, to give a few tutorials, just on the basis of my work, that it might have some interest for students. And on that basis, I was taking, 3 or 4, maybe 3 or 4 a year, opportunities to go and see other art schools and talk to students. And I noticed a difference starting to creep in the 1990s. I noticed that the resources were not quite as generous as they had been. I found studios where there'd formerly been maybe 12 or 15 students. They were now double that in the same space. I would have tutorials with students who would then say, well, you're the only person I've spoken to for 6 or 7 months who isn't my personal tutor. So this idea of a lot of voices, a lot of criticism, different levels of criticism, and opinions that contradicted themselves was not really happening. And the idea of this idea that art school education provides you with the space to do your own work, treats you as a putative artist, not a course, not a sort of set of courses, as it were, but you're allowed to do your own work in your own time. It seems to me to only work when you get the kind of critical framework in place that allows you to develop as an artist and as a person. Without that, I was starting to see courses here and there that almost looked like students were being warehoused rather than educated. And I began to be concerned by that. And a lot of my paintings, just referring to these now, have a kind of sense of a lot of these places that I was catching, as it were, before they went. institutional interiors, lounges, TV rooms. TV rooms don't exist anymore. They did then, and they were sort of common. Walkways, a kind of design aesthetic that applies to some of them, which is of a particular era. And I was catching them as they disappeared. You wouldn't find these places now. I started to wonder if that was going to be true of the art school that I was used to, that I'd seen, that I'd grown up with, that the interior would be the case. That would be the case with them. Whilst I was teaching at Goldsmiths, I had become interested just in the interior in the institution as a series of interior spaces. But the studios were populated. They were interesting spaces. They were populated with students, unfortunately, and their work. And I wasn't interested in making a portrait, as it were. I was interested in the space as a kind of abstraction, as a potential, or as Simon was explaining at the beginning. We had, at Goldsmiths, there was a seminar. The seminars were structured across the course, and there were rooms set aside for these seminars. And I always found these spaces interesting because they introduced, they were completely empty, just a few chairs. Students would come in, present their work, and everyone would talk about everyone else's work. I liked these spaces because they were empty. I stopped teaching at Goldsmiths in 2000, and that was the last time I had any formal connection with an art school that wasn't simply an invitation like this, or on some other occasion to visit and give a lecture and see some students. So I then began to have a little bit of distance that I was talking about at the beginning, and it occurred to me at some point that the empty art school studio might provide me with some material for paintings. That was the first idea. I think there were two things. There was two things that connected. One was this idea that I felt the art school that I knew might be under threat for some reason. Just a feeling. I wasn't quite sure. I wasn't able to articulate it. I'm not a professional teacher. It's not my business. My business is painting. But I did feel this intuitively. On the other hand, I also felt that the work I was doing was becoming, adopting a kind of romanticism that I felt I wanted to actually strip out of it. I wanted to find something a little bit more ascetic. So in the summer of 2009, I thought, I'll experiment with this. I'll go and visit a few art schools. I'll get out of London, because I didn't want everything to be London-centric at all. I visited some cathedral cities around the south of England. I went to Winchester. I went to Canterbury. I went to Norfolk. I went to Norwich. Sorry. I went to Coventry, and visited their art schools. And without any kind of formal constraints, or without any kind of real idea of how these images might be structured, I just arranged to go look at their empty studios and take some photographs as I found it. Wasn't sure. I had a lot of doubts about it, actually. I wasn't sure that it would have much content. I thought the images might be lacking in content. They might be a little bit too much. It might be a bit too much of art talking about art, which was something I'd always kind of tried to step back from slightly. So I was a little bit suspicious of my own motives for doing this. But the resulting photographs, and these are some of them, knocked me out, actually. I thought, good grief, there's so much going on in these. This image I loved. I've never actually used this image, but this is an image I really loved because it is that sort of seminar situation. You can envisage the discussion that's taken place here, and then they've left, and they've left it like this. I came in a few weeks after any students had been in here. This circle of chairs was still there. I just photographed it as it was. These were the photographs that I took on those occasions. I was thinking of them as subject matter for paintings, rather than as photographs in their own right, mainly because I'd never thought of any of my photographs as having any value at all. I'd only ever thought of them as material that I could, cannibalize in order to make the paintings I wanted to make. But as I was taking these, I began to think, well, maybe there's something about these as photographs, as well as the potential to become paintings. I wasn't using a particularly expensive or high-quality camera at all, but because I got interested in doing this as a project, I thought I'd better get a good camera, just in case I used the photographs themselves. It was 2 summers later that I actually embarked on the project properly with this new camera. I visited, as Simon said, 55 art schools over 2 summers, 2011 and 2012. And this is the list. And you can see that they go from Aberdeen in Scotland to Falmouth in Cornwall and Aberystwyth in Wales, Norwich and Norfolk and so on. Clusters of art schools in the northeast, in the northwest, in the Midlands, in the south, in Scotland. I organised this. I did this myself. I coordinated it. I contacted all the people I needed to contact. I turned up when there was a window of opportunity, when the studios were open. I financed it myself. No one helped me. It was just something I felt I wanted to do, and I felt it needed to be done, and I felt that art schools were incredibly underreported, underappreciated in a wider sense, and that they contributed such a huge amount to the culture and economy, let's not forget, of the UK, over certainly since the middle of the 20th century, in quantifiable ways, in ways that politicians don't ever seem to understand, and had liberated generations of people who'd been through the system, and provided an education that was in fact unique, that you couldn't get anywhere else. So there was this agenda that I was trying to follow in doing this, and it was very important that I visited all corners of the United Kingdom to sort of represent the UK. The model of teaching that I talked about, the self-governed model of teaching, originated in the UK. It originated with people like Tom Hudson and others, and in the 60s, certainly in the 70s, certainly in the 60s, it was a model that you struggle to find anywhere else in the world. It was a model that we exported. Tom Hudson, while he was Director of Studies at Cardiff, also was moonlighting to Brazil, where he was in charge of introducing art education at a higher level in Brazil. And these connections were going on internationally. So there was something that we had here that was homegrown, that worked, that really worked, that was underreported, underappreciated, and I felt, well, I can do this. I can do this. I can take these photographs. I can make this project. Why not? It'll result in paintings. It's kind of like entrepreneurial. It will pay for itself, but it needs to be done. So I still hadn't figured out quite how I was going to formally approach the images. The first place I went to was the Slade, just because it was local, and I knew people there. This is an image from the Slade. I made decisions about the photographs that they should all be vertically oriented, and I made this decision when I turned up on that first location. I hadn't really thought this out before I turned up. It was like just responding to the situation. I decided I didn't want to make panoramic views of the studios. I didn't want them to have that kind of landscape quality. I wanted them to be like samples of the space, like a scientific sample on a slide. So the photographs became all about framing. They exaggerate that sense of framing because there's so much to the left and the right which is being excluded. So that was the first decision I made, and all the photographs followed that format. The second thing I decided was that where possible, the photograph should almost look as though it's scanning the studio, so that walls, floors, ceilings are parallel to the picture plane of the photograph. This was all done in the studio. There was no post-production with these photographs. This is done in the studio. I also decided that where there was light, where there was natural light, enough natural light, I would switch off all the artificial lights and use natural light to take the photographs with. So these were some of the rules. This was an attempt to create a kind of level playing field across all the locations I was going to go to. The other decision was that all the art schools I went to and all the studios I visited were undergraduate studios doing fine art. So that meant no foundation, no art schools that just did foundation or other courses, no art schools that just did postgraduate, so that excluded the Royal College and the Royal Academy. There were enough London art schools that I had to visit anyway, so I wasn't too concerned. The art schools varied. Obviously, the institutions themselves, the buildings themselves, like the Slade, these are all from the Slade. There's a very old building. One of the characteristics we see all the time are the screens, the modern screens, the new screens, as it were, lining old studios. The old studios, the old architecture rising above the screens, giving that kind of junction in time between a period when art was taught in these studios with students together being taught, all doing the same thing, to a time when they were broken up and divided up into discrete studio spaces. So every student had their own space and did their own work. There's this kind of change of time, change of ideology, if you like, about art school teaching is visible in the internal architecture of the studios. Many of these, certainly the older art schools. I didn't touch anything that I found. I just photographed as I found. I used the framing to be selective. I didn't go and think, I'll just move that chair. It'd be better if that chair was over there. I just didn't do any of that. I just left everything as it was. All the work was done by the camera. And slowly, I visited all these different art schools. I had no real idea what the photographs would amount to. In the first summer, I visited something like 20 art schools. In the second summer, 35. This, you can see, is Edinburgh. There's Edinburgh Castle out the window. So there's all sorts of little references that creep up. The second summer, 2012, I wasn't even sure I was going to get up to Scotland. I was really glad I did, because actually there's 4 art schools in Scotland: Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen. Provided me with some of the best images as far as developing paintings afterwards was concerned. Just because of the nature of them. This is Manchester with its weird kind of Gothic windows. What I encountered in Manchester, I encountered the head of department there was telling me that this fantastic art school, this fantastic art school, which had been there since the 19th century, was under threat because the university, the art school was then now attached to, wanted to give the art department a brand new building and used this for some other kind of part of the university, for some other course being developed in the university, which they were fighting and which I regarded as kind of an incredibly bad idea, because these were wonderful studios designed for artists to work in, full of natural light, beautifully designed. Why would you put them in something newer that looked more like an office block when you had this incredible building here? Those kind of things were sort of supported my idea that, you know, the art school education that I've sort of valued was in many ways under threat. This is Glasgow School of Art before the fire. Whole load of photographs of Glasgow School of Art before the fire. Every art school, of course, has its own, is similar in that it has this, you know, this carapace of boards and screens, and the original architecture rises up behind. I got to Liverpool, this is Liverpool, and I really didn't know what to make of it. I thought I was going to go to the original School of Art, the one I'd been to once before, back in the 70s. But the address turned out to be somewhere different. It was an office block, or looked like an office block. And I was a little bit discombobulated when I went in through the front door and was met with a lobby that looked like a corporate headquarters, or the headquarters of a new modern hotel, with smart people behind a desk. And I said, "Is this the art school?" "Yes." And where is fine art? It's on the top floor. And this was it. And this view. I've only published the one photograph from this, but this is extremely typical. There was no the kind of screens are still there, but there are tables that laid out right in front of the screens. It's not a very big space. I couldn't for the life of me imagine how someone would make art objects in this space. I couldn't imagine making a painting even in this space, because there was nowhere you would have a floor-to-ceiling bit of wall that you could get back from to look at it, or make a three-dimensional object. And in a way, it encapsulated the problem I began to see emerging, which is a philosophical change, and it's an economic change, which is that running an art school with big studios, big airy studios like this is Aberdeen, great windows, fantastic light, in which students get given a lot of space, enough space to do whatever they want to do, is incredibly expensive. It costs money. It costs money in terms of the real estate, in terms of the value of the building, the value of the floor space that could be so much more profitably used elsewhere. This was the problem with Manchester. It's also expensive to do properly, to resource properly with the staffing that's needed so that students get that kind of critical framework I was talking about. It just seemed to encapsulate that problem. The photographs amount to, like I said, a few hundred. This is 264 of them, which I regard as the kind of the archive, the central archive. The photographs exist in two forms only. One is the book, the other is this postcard installation, which I made a small edition of these on my kitchen table, printing these postcards of every single image like this, because I think there's an edition of 10. And this is this postcard installation on show in an exhibition in Germany. Just everything laid out flat, but on a very small scale. The book, on the other hand, I also had a very big hand in designing, in which obviously the pages and the turning of the pages and the flow of images through the book is very, very important, and the kind of references and connections and geometric connections between one image and another become very key. I organised the book, that list of places at you saw earlier, going from Aberdeen to Wrexham, alphabetically. I organised the photographs in the book also alphabetically, so there was no preference, there was no other organisation. But some institutions warranted 7 or 8 photographs, some institutions only got 1. And I didn't label these, so there's no way of knowing, once you've left Aberdeen, you're on your own. You don't know where you are really, roughly, until you get the last photograph, and that's obviously Wrexham. So, and it works through the book. It becomes like one continuous art school, you know. There are blank pages, as you can see. There are pages where things meet, where things link together, like that. So the book was published in 2013. It wasn't something it was something I became increasingly interested in doing, and Riding House got to hear of the project and supported it. So it was published by Riding House, with the support of my galleries as well. So they put money into that. From the photographs also then came the meat and veg of the project, in a sense. Depends how you look at it, really. The photographs are essentially documentary. They show you what was in front of the camera when the shutter went down. It doesn't lie, you know, and there's been no post-production to the photographs. So what you see in the photographs was there. Paintings are not like that, of course. Paintings are not documentary. They never can be. They are kind of fictions that, at best, try and attempt to reach a truth on a different basis in a non-documentary way, let's say. These are 3 paintings. These are about as big as they got, because these paintings, the art school paintings, were done on panel. I decided that they needed to be on a hard material, not a yielding stretched linen, but on a hard panel, reflecting the surfaces that were being painted. Of course, they get quite heavy. So these are about 6 foot by 4 foot, and that's, you know, as heavy as I could manage on my own, moving them around the studio. So that was a kind of size limitation for them. These are 3 based on photographs taken in Coventry, actually. And I think here, just to give you an idea, the two paintings on the right are quite closely following the photographs they're from. Very, very flat, very, very minimalist. It was important, it kind of gave me an opportunity to make paintings that were very flat and very minimalist, that had sort of zero content in terms of their aesthetic, but lots of content in terms of what they're of and potentially about. So it was possible to make these paintings that were, you know, very, very, very minimalist and abstract and flat. The painting on the left, I wanted to sort of finish the sequence of three. They're not an official triptych, but an unofficial triptych, and they still exist as a triptych where they are now. But to do that, of course, I needed to change that photograph. So the image on the left is the photograph from which the painting on the right derives. And so the painting on the right follows the geometry, if you like, of the other previous two photographs and the previous two paintings on its right. But it's adapted all the details and all the information I could from the actual photograph that's there on the left. So you can see it's been reproportioned. The chairs, the table's been taken out. This is what I mean by the paintings are not documents. The paintings start to fictionalize it. But in doing so, they attempt to arrive at a different kind of truth, for want of a better way of saying it. The paintings varied from that kind of abstract, the more abstract paintings, the more abstract sort of images, to things which were more, I use the word pictorial, more pictorial, I say, where there's more going on with furniture, with potential narratives that you might be able to read into these, the students that's left, the great evidence of work that's occurred in the space, the work that's been done, work that's going to be done. This isn't a very big painting, it's about 90 centimetres by 60. But it's packed with quite a lot of detail. I've just included this to show you physically the paintings in a space. This is an exhibition at the Curling Gallery in Dublin, and it gives you a sense. You can see the edges of the paintings over there. You can see that the aluminium and wood that make the panels, and you can see that they have quite a strong abstract quality to them. I actually began life as an abstract painter. So when I was a student at the Slade, I was making paintings that were very influenced by Bryce Marden's panel paintings. So for me, there was also this return to a subject matter that referenced a kind of abstraction that I'd once been very, very wedded to, but doing so in a figurative way, and also in a way that referenced the environment in which those early paintings were made by me. So there's an awful lot of autobiography going on in these paintings, and reference to my own autobiography. This is Glasgow, and one of the things I found, well, this is a detail, just to give you a sense, this is a detail of that painting on the right. You can see there's a lot going on there that you can't really see from a distance, but there's all the marks and spats and stains of the wood and scratches and torn black paint and holes in the wood. They're all there. I paint them all in. So when you get up to the paintings, however sort of much they're referencing abstraction, they are really, ferociously figurative. Now, one of the features of, the way the art schools work is, and comes to the idea of the degree show, which I've not talked about at all, never mind, is that students, of course we all know that the studios are dismantled for the degree show. So come June, all the real rabbit warren of studio spaces that is in place within the interior of the big studios gets taken out, and a much simpler version is put back. So because you're not providing spaces for 120 students, you're providing spaces for 40 students. Okay, so it becomes a much more sort of economical use of space. Screens are taken out, put back together, mixed up. Student might paint a space black because they're going to do a dark projection or some other colour for some other reason. The end of the shows come down, the screens are all mixed up again, the new spaces are all built into some kind of rabbit warren again for the next bunch of students coming in September, and all these kind of screens get mixed up, red against black, against blue, against unpainted, against white, lots of white. So you get this kind of mixture. This was something that I capitalised on in terms of just developing a kind of aesthetic that developed that kind of related to that Bryce Marden influence I was talking about. There was a whole series of paintings like this where the colour derives from ideas or derives from things that I actually observed but were fictionalised for the sake of the painting. Okay. Right, enough of that. This was I did 4 or 5 shows during this period because I worked with a number of galleries. This is a show I did in New York with my New York gallery. Each show was called Art School. Each show was a different grouping of paintings, new paintings as they were being done during this period. And again, this is that kind of ubiquitous corner of the studio, the sink, the paint marks. This is Edinburgh, actually. And it's in one of the sculpture studios, hence this kind of vestige of this frieze going around the top. These stone carvings that they have in this studio. And and again, this is a detail of that painting showing, you know, I get really into all that stuff, all the kind of detail of mess and mark and splashes of work and paint and vestiges of things that have gone on there. Or there's this very simple image, which is a mirror image studio in the same place in Edinburgh, next door, without the frieze. A very simple image that really just deals with the way the light falls in the studio. So I actually think of these as, although I was talking about American abstraction in relation to some paintings, I also think of these as relating to sort of Dutch 17th century painting. And they're both two strands of my work or 2 reference points for my work that have always been there, I think. But it does express an idea about about the softness of light and the pleasure of that when you actually experience it, feel self in real life in these spaces. Often, however, you know, I'm making paintings of things that are almost invisible in real life. They're things you don't really see. There was a slightly apocryphal story, I'm going to bring this to a close in a minute, when I was in one of the London art schools and I was taking photographs. I had permission to be there, everything. The studios were empty, setting up the camera, photographing some screens, white screens in an empty studio, forming an empty studio. A member of staff came out of a door and said, you know, who are you and what are you doing? I said, it's fine, I've got permission, I'm here to photograph the studio. But there's nothing to see. There's nothing to see. Obviously, I'd missed the day when all the students had been there and all the work was there. And for this person, there was nothing to see. I said, there's lots to see, I'm just photographing the screens. And we had this kind of discussion, and she went off in an absolute rage to find out who on earth this strange person was photographing this completely empty studio. I did think again about the idea of the Goldsmith seminar, and this is a painting I made by returning to Goldsmiths after the event and photographing one of their they call them convener meetings. Okay, don't ask for details. We'll be here till the end of the day if I have to explain it all. And I made 2 or 3 paintings actually. I made that painting. I also made this painting, same image but in a vivid yellow, so that it was almost like it dazzled the eyes. You couldn't see anything except the yellow when you first confront it, and then slowly the image starts to reveal itself. A bit like when I wrote about this, I said it's a bit like the kind of clarity that slowly sort of emerges sometimes should emerge in a seminar itself, you know, make sense of the work that you're looking at and discussing over time. And then this painting on the left marked a return to Cardiff when I found out that my old art school was going to be, Cardiff College of Art, was going to be abandoned to the developers. Beautiful, fantastic, purpose-built post-war building, built in the 60s, right in the, unfortunately, in the heart of Cardiff. The art school had got into debt, apparently. This is what I understand. One way of paying it off was to abandon the building, sell it, pay off the debt, move out of town to somewhere. I've never been to this new place. I don't know where it is. But the old place was fantastic. It was right in the heart of the town. It was connected to the town. It was connected to the life of the town. And when I was there, it was connected to the life of Tiger Bay, as well as the city centre and all that kind of life and energy. And then it was going to be moved out to somewhere slightly outside of suburbia. It just seemed to me that something was going to be really lost. And I made this painting of a corner of a studio in which I had had my degree show. There's the connection. I knew I was going to get there in the end. In which I had had my degree show. So it's a very nostalgic kind of image. I'm not going to say very much. This was a set of prints I made. This is one of those prints. It's a combination of photo etching and woodblock printing. Just to show you that other things emerged from the project. So watercolours, works on paper, drawings. These are 2 watercolours. And finally, the last 3 paintings were this group of yellow, very yellow, pale paintings based on this photograph. Again, just to show you that they are the photographs of the paintings have a tenuous connection. All the stuff in that photograph is there. It's just bleached out. It's turned yellow. It's a very, very different experience to look at. This series was called Frame. This is my studio in London. These are 2 of those paintings. And that was the end of that project. These were the last works in the project that I did in 2016. Just to summarise, I think, it was a project I really committed myself to for 5 years. I've never done a project where I just did one thing all the time. The previous paintings you saw of windows with net curtains and TV rooms and walkways were all done all together, all mixed up. Going through time, but basically there was no one thing I was exclusively doing. The art school paintings, the art school project was a project I exclusively did. I did it at the exclusion of everything else, and I did it for 5 years. So it's unique in that respect. I sometimes wonder what people will make of these images in, say, 30, 25 years' time. 25 years ago, I made that series of paintings about the TV room because it was something everyone knew, everyone recognised, they were everywhere, and it was part of a project to do with the viewer. But I wanted to use an image that was well embedded within the culture. Of course, now TV rooms don't exist anymore. They don't exist because technology has moved on. They're a social construct from a previous era. We look at them out of curiosity now. It's probably wonder what on earth these places are. I wonder if we're going to think that about some of these images. That not only is the art school that we've all worked in for the since the middle of the 20th century is under threat because of funding and resources, but also because of a change in the concept of potentially what constitutes art. Because these studio spaces are predicated on the idea that what students do is produce art objects, whether it's painting, sculpture, 3-dimensional objects, film, photography, performance, installation, whatever it is. It's a 3-dimensional thing, it's an object, and the object is the thing that carries the meaning and it's the thing you discuss. But we're living in an age where that's changing. And what was clearly being argued in that case with Manchester was that they didn't need that space anymore because the future was digital. You didn't need to be making things. You didn't need to be responding to the physical object. You could do so much more on screen and digitally, and that was the future. So the model we saw with Liverpool School of Art actually is kind of developing that idea, I think. I think that's the sort of work I could envisage doing there rather than the actual making of physical objects. So who knows, you know, in the future, in 25 years' time, maybe these spaces will look, despite all their austere quality, minimal quality, they may look exotic. Thank you.